These gates into Gaza were used for Hamas to break out of Gaza and go and murder Israelis in cold blood. Iran is at the heart of absolutely every problem. You know, the three H's, the terrorist groups of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all sponsored, trained, funded by Iran. Putin has put his... He doesn't care how many people he murders. He doesn't care how many people go through the meat grinder of a frontline. And it matters here because if Putin were to win that war, he wouldn't stop in Ukraine. He'd carry on. Putin just knows basically no end to his own evil.
Their positions they're practicing. Point accuracy over targets is what has transformed so much of this conflict.
This is World at War, The Sun's brand new weekly defence show, helping you to make sense of chaos and conflict around the world. And with me today is none other than Britain's Defence Minister, Secretary of State Grant Shapps, the man who warned we're living in a pre-war world. Grant, perhaps you could start by just telling us, what do you expect to happen in Gaza now?
We saw that ceasefire and hostage exchange a long time ago now, which eventually broke down. This has now gone on for many, many months. You've still got those hostages being held. As has been said, there's actually a very generous offer when you think about it. You'd get a few dozen hostages released. In return, a 40-day ceasefire, thousands of Palestinians released, and an opportunity to build from that, more importantly, into the permanent ceasefire that everybody wants to see, to get the humanitarian aid in and bring this thing to a close. So, quite a big offer being made. We now wait to see where Hamas go on this.
But we know that Benjamin Netanyahu is being told by members of his own cabinet that to accept a peace deal, that to not invade Rafah would be a capitulation, would be showing, in their words, the white flag. I mean, what's your message to Netanyahu?
For a start, the issue with Israel's government is it's a coalition. It's a big rainbow of very, very disparate views. So, I mean, of course, you'll always find someone who says this or don't do that or do this. I think, given the level of human suffering from this conflict, which of course started with a terrorist organisation going and slaughtering people, and then everything that's happened since, bringing this to a conclusion is absolutely essential. It's in, obviously, the Palestinian people's interest. It's in Israel's interest. It's in the world's interest to see that happen. The route to that is by releasing hostages, the thing which started all of this.
Why is there a need to build a brand new port? I mean, it seems like an extraordinarily complicated, no doubt very expensive way to get aid in. Israel has existing ports.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, so I should explain. It's a pier rather than a port. So effectively, it's a temporary extension from a ship that creates this thing. So it's not a full pier. Actually, what I really want to see happen, and I've spoken to my opposite number several times about this, many times about it, right from the beginning. Yoav Gallant, who's the defense minister in Israel, is we want to see Ashdod in particular, which is a port in Israel, receive the aid, probably from the route across from Cyprus, and then get it as quickly as possible into Gaza. Now, previously, I've been successful with others, persuading the Israelis to open up Kerem Shalom. That's in the southeast corner of Gaza from Israel, and aid is getting in that way. I'd also like to see Eretz, which is in the north of Gaza, opened. That road route would be very efficient. Now, I can understand...
Would it be more efficient than here?
I think, I think what you really want to do is everything. But yes, I think the road route and via a port would be very, very helpful. And I continue to make that point to Israel. Look, I think psychologically, the difficulty for Israel has been these gates into Gaza were used for Hamas to break out of Gaza and go and murder Israelis in cold blood. And then you've got a situation where we're all saying to Israel, look, could you just reopen those gates and now send in aid through the same gates that we used for terrorists to come out and murder you? And I think that has been quite psychologically difficult for Israel, the public in Israel, to bear. But I think it's critically important.
There are reports that the UK is considering putting boots in the ground to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza. Could you sort of clarify these reports?
Well, we never kind of get into operational kind of planning. We'll definitely assist wherever we can on this, but the safety of British troops, you'll understand as British Defence Secretary, is my paramount concern. But we're looking with the Americans at how best we can use our various different facilities. And as I say, we're already committed with Cardigan Bay, the support ship, which will be a sort of command and control for all of this, and actually involves 150 Americans on board helping to coordinate this whole operation. Precisely how it all then lands, who then receives it, etc. I can't go into those kind of operational details.
Would it be an option under consideration though for UK? I mean, presumably the pier will need some form of security and management.
So there'd be a lot of things that would need to happen, including a very large security cordon around it, including air cover and many other things. As I can't really go into operational details, but I will never send British troops somewhere which is sort of reckless or would endanger lives.
Just on that exact point, we have, of course, as you mentioned, warships and RAF jets shooting down Iranian-made missiles and drones in the region. We've got British troops risking their lives as part of Operation Shader to counter the threat of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. How worried are you that what's happening in the Middle East could spiral into a wider war?
Well, frankly, it's been my concern since October the 7th. I mean, that has been the number one thing. And I think actually when you saw what the Iranian attack of hundreds of drones, ballistic and cruise missiles the other week, I think the fear for the world at that moment was that Israel might react and even size their response in a manner that could have led to now a regional conflict which was bigger. We obviously all spoke to our Israeli opposite numbers, and I think the Israeli response was precise and exact, and actually a more mature response, which has prevented this from spiraling into the next stage, which I think, on that Saturday night, wasn't it, when Iran fired for the first time at Israel after all of these decades of saber rattling. I think it was very possible to imagine this would have evolved in a far worse way in the weeks since. So Israel actually, I think, acted very responsibly, very precise. I mean, of course, Iran will pretend nothing was hit. We know that wasn't the case. Nonetheless, very much welcome that it hasn't led to the next, extension of this regional conflict.
Do you think that risk has now passed? Are we through the moment of highest danger?
Anyone who can predict the Middle East is an incredible prophet, I would say, because the one thing we know about this region is it's a difficult neighbourhood to be in. The other thing I know for certain is Iran is at the heart of absolutely every problem. The three H's, the terrorist groups of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all sponsored, trained, funded by Iran. They're Iran-aligned militia groups who, fire on anyone who they don't like. Essentially, again, great instability, and then Iran themselves firing hundreds of projectiles. They are at the heart of the problem. And what's really interesting when I speak to my Middle East opposite numbers, whether in Israel or the Arab states or in the Gulf states, they all agree that Iran is at the heart of the problem. They are the massive instability in that area, in that region. And it's really important that we're clear about that. And I thought very interestingly, when Iran did fire at Israel, quietly and without great fanfare, it was quite clear that the rest of the Arab world didn't agree with what Iran was doing.
And they took part in helping to stop those strikes?
Absolutely.
I mean, Iran, of course, is also supplying the Shahed kamikaze one-way attack drones to Ukraine. And I wanted to actually talk about Ukraine for a moment, if we can. I mean, Russia is advancing. Ukraine is getting hammered on an almost nightly basis by these sort of complex airstrikes hitting critical national infrastructure, killing civilians, killing children. It's as bad almost as it's ever been. You've announced an extra 500 million in British aid for Ukraine. I think it takes it to 3 billion, the UK aid this year. And of course, America's finally unblocked that much bigger, but $61 billion aid package for Kyiv for military aid. We're focusing on what we're doing, what you're doing. What are you sending, and how's it going to make a difference?
Yeah. So as you say, we've added ours up now to 3 billion for this year. In previous 2 years of the war, we did 2.3 billion, so a big increase. But I've also done last week the biggest single gifting package of equipment to our Ukrainian friends. It's really, really important that Britain carries on doing what we've done from the outset, which is to lead the world in terms of our response. We've been the most forward-leaning country from the beginning. We were training before the main war got started. Right after Ukraine was invaded Crimea back in 2014, we started to train Ukrainian troops. We've now done 65,000 Ukrainian troops. We're the first to send in anti-tank missiles, the first to send in main battle tanks, the first to send in missiles with the permissions to use them properly, and the first to sign an agreement with Ukraine, which we call our 100-year partnership with Ukraine. And now we're going to be the first also to provide, and you'll recall, we don't have F-16 planes, we just don't fly the aircraft. Ukraine is getting a load of those. We're going to provide the glide bombs for those aircraft as well. So we are really stepping up. And actually in a much bigger way than perhaps is apparent, because the US package actually includes replenishment for their own US stocks. So the 61 billion isn't all for Ukraine. I think we need to use that leadership at this incredibly difficult time during the war, where, as you rightly say, Putin has put his... He doesn't care how many people he murders. He doesn't care how many people go through the meat grinder of a front line. He will just carry on sending them because he's not accountable in any kind of recognisable democratic way. And we've got to help our Ukrainian friends defend themselves. And that is why I think us both sending them another $500 million on top of our already record size thing, all this extra kit, and then saying to the rest of NATO, we're going to increase our budget now to 2.5% of GDP, which is what we want to set as the new NATO minimum spend. And that's what we're going to be saying to NATO come the 75th anniversary. I think in that way we can lead again and make sure that Ukraine gets what it needs to win this war.
And Grant, you and I obviously follow events in Ukraine really closely, but to someone who isn't following it that closely, I mean, it sounds like an awful lot of money, and now it sounds like more money on top of an awful lot of money. What can you actually point to? You know, how has British aid made a difference on the battlefield?
It matters here, and it matters here because if Putin were to win that war, he wouldn't stop in Ukraine. He'd carry on. He's talked about other areas that he thinks should be part of Greater Russia, basically the old Soviet Union. That would affect us. Other autocratic leaders around the world would look at this and go, well, the West can be beaten. You just have to carry on for a couple of years and we all give in. So what does that mean in Taiwan, for example, and the chips that are made there and the way that affects our economy? So the connection back to anyone watching this is direct.
This $3 billion, I understand that it's going to continue. How long will that pledge continue?
Yeah, so that was the other thing we announced last week, and I'm really pleased you mentioned actually, because it was almost lost in the flurry of we're going to spend 2.5% of our GDP on defence and what have you. But we also said we will now match the $3 billion we spent every single year, at least till the end of the decade. I mean, I'm not making a prediction about the length of the war because who knows, but that's another 5-6 years, and we'll do $3 billion a year every single year. And I wanted to do that because when I speak to President Zelensky, it is really important that he knows that we're in this for the long term. And this isn't just, otherwise they're living hand to mouth with this. We want them to know that Britain is there. And he will say, as Zelensky has said to me, without Britain, they just don't know where they would have been without our leadership.
But Britain has said, and you've said, as long as it takes. Britain stands with Ukraine as long as it takes. But you must have some sense, how long it might take. Is this a forever war?
Well, look, it's not right now. It was frozen on the front line, as you rightly say. Russia has been moving west, not particularly fast, but they've been making gains. That's absolutely sure. It took far too long to get the money through Congress, and frankly, everybody needs to step up. I don't think even if you're a European nation now, but you're not a member of NATO, maybe it's time to think about it, right? Because, as actually has recently happened with Sweden and Finland joining, you can't really be neutral in a world in which an autocrat is prepared to just go and seize neighbours' land. How can you stay neutral in that situation? And I think everybody needs to be contributing. Everybody needs to be getting on board on this continent, let alone America. I mean, they don't live on this continent. It's great they come and help. But it's also our responsibility, which is why, as I say, 2.5%.
Is there anyone you'd single out? Anyone you think needs to be doing more?
Well, anyone who's not currently, frankly, a member of NATO, but enjoys NATO's protection. I think it is time for people to think about, given a tyrant, once again, we've seen this before in history, moving west. I think it's time to kind of stop and review.
And just quickly on that, I know Aina wants to come in, but there is a risk that with elections in America, there could be a change of administration, and it's uncertain, were Donald Trump to become president, how he would or whether he would support Ukraine. Indeed, he said he could end the war in a day, and that his plan is to effectively make Kyiv capitulate. In that scenario, are you confident that the rest of NATO, or rather the rest of the Ukraine alliance, the contact group, can continue to support Ukraine without America?
I mean, first of all, I was talking to the NATO Secretary General last week, Stoltenberg, about this in Poland, and he rightly points out, I agree, that actually, he's dealt with, and we all have, actually, a Trump presidency before, and, NATO still goes and all the rest of it. But actually, more to the point, in that very delicate vote in Congress, it really hinged on the Speaker, Mike Johnson, supporting the vote going through, and then the more, what you call radical, I suppose, Republicans not going after Speaker Johnson as a result of him doing that. And Trump was very interesting in this. He specifically went out of his way to support Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker. Now, he could have gone the opposite way, and I think it's conceivable if he had done, that the package may have had trouble passing. Trump didn't do that. So I also think with these things, judge people on their actions rather than their words, and I think that's really true of Trump.
You think Trump's changed his mind on Ukraine?
I don't know whether it's changed his mind, but look, as I said before, if you think about America's interests, even if you took the view that some of the most, call them extreme commentators in America might, or politicians of Europe doesn't matter, we're not worried. Even if you took that view, I don't think many people think that, but even if you did, if you're America, you still care about what happens in China and Taiwan and chip manufacturing and all these other things. And as I said before, the single message you'd send to autocrats everywhere, if the West said you can't just walk into your neighbour and take it over as Putin's done with Ukraine, and then we go, well, actually, we're sort of a bit of an attention deficit over a couple of years and we're sort of bored of it, so you can now. If you did that, then America's own power would be directly hit by that, and Trump would recognise that as much as the next person. I think he does.
I think bringing back US policies to Ukraine's front line, I'd love to ask, the Americans have signalled they're uncomfortable with long-range strikes actually into Russian territory. But last week, Britain's Chief of Defence, Admiral Tony Radakin, said that Britain supports these attacks. Would you be able to sort of clarify the UK's position on this?
Well, look, first of all, I'm obviously not going to get into sort of tactics and those sort of things, other than to say two things. First, we've always been quite forward-leaning on all of this, and you've seen how, given that Putin walked into Crimea and just took it in 2014 and there was no military fight back, you've seen how our brave Ukrainian friends have been opening up the Black Sea. In fact, the Russian Black Sea fleet no longer sails in the Black Sea, and certainly doesn't sail at its own liberty in the Black Sea, because Ukrainians who don't have a navy have managed to make it inoperable for Putin's navy. So Britain has always been supportive of the whole of Ukraine being, back under Ukrainian control. Secondly, in terms of Ukraine's own tactics and how they prosecute the war, we can't realistically have a position where everyone accepts Ukrainian critical national infrastructure like power stations and what have you being blasted to bits, and they go, but Ukraine, you can't attack the infrastructure of the country who are attacking you. We won't let you do. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But it is a decision. Those things are a decision for Ukraine. We are not direct combatives in this war, and we will never be, because this is not a NATO country, Ukraine. So they don't come under Article 5 protection, and that will have to be a question for Ukraine themselves.
I'd like to ask about Russia's reach into NATO countries, and I want to ask you specifically about GPS jamming. Now, you remember I was lucky or perhaps unlucky enough to be on your Royal Air Force jet.
Our famous trip together.
Yeah, when we were flying back, and that aircraft was jammed in eastern Poland. We've since at The Sun done an investigation which reveals the extent of this. I mean, thousands of civilian flights are getting jammed almost on a daily basis, and just last week there were two Finnair aircraft that turned back on their way to Estonia because of the jamming affecting their navigation systems. That has prompted leaders in the Baltic states to warn of a looming air disaster. I mean, how serious is this and what's being done?
Yeah. Well, look, on one level, completely irresponsible to be jamming those GPS signals. And, we were flying, via south of Kaliningrad, I think. And we experienced jams for about, 20, 25 minutes. But actually, I'm a pilot myself, and I was chatting to the pilots about it. There was by the way, absolutely no drama about it at all. As a pilot, there are many other ways that you can navigate an aircraft, and including talking to air traffic control, but also time-based navigation systems, which are not GPS. So it's usually perfectly safe to fly, but in congested skies, GPS is an important part of that. And I think we are seeing a world in which GPS, both jamming and spoofing, so aircraft being shown where they're not and that sort of thing, has become increasingly critical. First of all, utterly condemn people doing that. Again, Putin just knows basically no end to his own evil, is my view. But as the British military in particular, we're developing systems which use things like precise navigational time, PNT, in order to use systems which don't require GPS satellites from space to tell you where you are.
And do you think it's feasible that civilian aircraft might need to adopt
Yes,
that?
and they already do to an extent. So even on the aircraft we were on, actually they have systems on there which were able to tell us where we were based on what time did you take off and what altitude you were at and all those types of things. Those systems are becoming more and more precise all the time. And I can confirm actually that defence research and development is at the cutting edge of doing even more with this. And I imagine that in years to come, probably all aircraft will have many alternative versions of navigation for exactly this reason. But how irresponsible to block GPS, knowing that you're blocking civilian airlines.
And staying on the topic of threats to the UK, let's talk about the home front for a moment. Times are hard, there's no money in the Treasury, but you've managed to secure 2.5% of GDP on defence. I now understand that was going to take 10 years, it's now going to be achieved in 6. What suddenly changed?
Yeah, so look, first of all, if you think about defence of the realm, that is the first and primary duty of any government. And I was sufficiently satisfied as Defence Secretary at a time of a war in Europe, a major conflict in the Middle East, a much more assertive China, North Korea, nuclear armed, Iran, creating all of those problems regionally, but developing nuclear as well, and Putin's outrageous behaviour in Europe, that these are more dangerous times. In January, I went to Lancaster House in London and I made a speech about how we're living in more dangerous times, and I specifically coined the phrase, perhaps we've moved from a post-war to a pre-war world. Not because I think we're about to go to war, I don't, and we obviously don't want to, but because I think that it was time to alert people that the best way to defend yourself is, and prevent your adversaries from thinking that they can try it on, is to make sure that you build up your own defences. And I thought we'd taken the peace dividend too many times.
Threats from Iran, you mentioned North Korea, China, Russia as well, and obviously, just sort of bubbling conflicts around the world. And yet, for all this extra money, you remain a Secretary of State for Defence who's presiding over the smallest army in 300 years or so. On D-Day, the Royal Navy mustered 1,000 vessels for the first day of the D-Day landings. Today, the Royal Navy has 17 frigates and destroyers, and it's got a couple of aircraft carriers as well, but it's much, much shrunk. And we don't know for certain, I think, how many F-35s the RAF is actually eventually going to get. And my question really is quite simple. Given those threats that you've just outlined so eloquently, are the UK's armed forces large enough?
So, simple answer, if you were at war, as we were at D-Day, you would have conscription. Right, so you would then have an army many, many times the size. I think it's actually looking only at the army is only to look at part of the
the whole armed
picture.
forces.
Yes, so but often people do just kind of default to the army. But actually, if you take the whole armed forces, Navy, Air Force, and of course these days, space, as we were just talking about, but also cyber, actually, there are a couple 100,000 people, not the 73,000 often quoted. What I'm really interested in, though, primarily is the lethality of what we do, right? So we are the second biggest spender in NATO. We are the biggest spender militarily in Europe by a country mile, as Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, was pointing out last week. And we are one of the only militaries who have totally global reach. So we will have, and by the way, we have about 76 ships. I'll shortly be saying more about our as a shipbuilding czar, which is one of the Defence Secretary's official titles. I'll be saying more about this shortly. But we have truly global reach. We are in every single ocean. We can deploy around the world. And it's really interesting because I hear your question, but look at which are the only countries who've been hitting the Houthis? Which are the only countries which were involved in defending Israel when it was under attack from Iran from outside of the region? America and Britain. Every time we're the country who steps up. So yeah, sure, I'm Defence Secretary. I could always argue we could do more, but are we capable? Absolutely. Are we willing? Yes, as demonstrated. And are we investing in the right kit? Well, that's my job to make sure that we are. But I often see the stuff massively undersold. RAF, for example, we have the greatest lift capacity in the RAF's history. But you wouldn't think that when you often read about this, which is only ever a story of how it's not big enough.
But can I just build on what you've tantalisingly hinted that there might be more coming on the shipbuilding strategy? I mean, would I be right in assuming you're going to announce more ships? And that would suggest you don't think the armed forces, as they currently stand, are substantial enough, and you want to make. Well,
I'll just be completely black and white about it. I'm not going to do the announcement now, but I'll be completely black and white about it. I wouldn't have gone out and made that speech at Lancaster House if I imagined that for the world that is now with us and upcoming, we and our allies were sufficiently prepared. That is why I use the words, I believe that we've taken the peace dividend probably now too many times, and that we were moving potentially from a post-war to a pre-war world. So, of course, I think we need to do more. And what's more? The Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the Cabinet agree, and that is why we have just announced 2.5%, £75 billion uplift.
In this pre-war environment that you talk about, what are you going to buy, and does the UK need an Iron Dome missile defence like Israel has and has used so well so far?
So first of all, in terms of what we're going to buy, I will set out a lot of the things that, actually, I'll be completely upfront with you, a lot of this is to make sure we can deliver the things that we always said we wanted to do properly, but there are extra things that we want to do. So munitions. I mean, this war in Ukraine has absolutely shown that the world doesn't have enough stockpiles. We're going to add to our existing plans for munitions with another £1 billion a year over the next 10 years. So I was at the Storm Shadow factory on Thursday, seeing those Storm Shadows that have been so significant to the world with to our Ukrainian friends. Us, along with other countries, have provided these long-range missiles, but we want a lot more of them on stockpile. We need that for our own safety and to defend the West. So stockpiles are going to be a big part of it. I'm afraid you will probably have to wait a little bit for the rest of my announcement, but I'll tell you where my priorities are. I really believe in recruiting and retaining our brave armed forces. I want them to have a better deal. So their housing, their accommodation, their service accommodation, big uplift in the quality of that. I've put £4 billion aside from the package to do more of that. And then you ask about an Iron Dome sort of thing. Of course, that attracted great interest because Israel was using it to shoot down the Iranian missiles. So first of all, there's a regional context to this. Israel, as we've discussed, are in a difficult neighbourhood. We are, A, not in that neighbourhood, but B, more importantly, have the cover of NATO. Now, NATO's Article 5 says, in our case, that 31 other countries come to our immediate defence by law if we are attacked. So you would be insane to fire missiles at us in the same way. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is, of course, we have the ultimate declared deterrent, which is the nuclear deterrent. Again, you'd be rather crazy to kind of come after the UK. And importantly, but often not discussed, we actually already have a system of layered protection. Includes something which is called the quick response, a QRA, which is where to prevent a 9/11 type attack, we have typhoons ready to scramble. And as Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister and others, we're 24 hours on duty to provide executive orders on that. We have also a Sky Saber system, which is a missile system to take down incoming, and a number of other things I can't go into. Having said all of that in this rather long answer, we're also working with our European neighbours on what a European Sky Shield might look like as well. And we're in the early stages of work on that as well. But for all sorts of reasons, we're not in that sort of Israeli situation where actually Hamas were already firing rockets at Israel on a daily basis, hundreds, thousands of them each year, and so were Lebanese Hezbollah. So they had a rather more pressing need, not being in NATO as well, to have those things in place.
So possibly a Sky Shield, but no Iron Dome for now. Grant, thank you very, very much for joining The World at War with The Sun. If you're watching this on YouTube and you have any questions for us, then please ask them in the comments below and we will do our best to answer them for you next week. As I said, my name is Jerome Starkey and you've been watching The World at War. Thank you very much for joining us.